I am joined by Dr. Rainer Zitelmann, who's a historian, sociologist, and best-selling author. I think he's published something like 27 books. You can tell me the actual number, Dr. Zitelmann. He's joining us from Berlin, Germany, and we'll be discussing his latest book, How Nations Escape Poverty. Dr. Zitelmann, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me. Yes, it's 29 books now.
29.
I hope next year it will be 30.
How do you have so much free time to put out 29 books?
Yes, the reason is because I was an entrepreneur, and for 15 years I earned a lot of money as an entrepreneur and real estate investor. But I sold my company 8 years ago. And so now I have the funds I don't have to work anymore because I earned enough money. And my research is very expensive for my book, In Defense of Capitalism. I commissioned polls in 35 countries, the biggest poll ever about the image of capitalism. And this cost me $650,000. You never can get it back from selling books, of course. And for my next book, by the way, I'm looking for a publisher for my next book. It's called Liberty Road Trip. It's the English translation is finished. I traveled to 30 countries in the last 20 months to promote capitalism and also to find out about the causes of wealth and poverty. And this was all in all, the research and the travel costs 1.5 million euros. I could only afford it. I had, unfortunately, no one who supported me. So I have the time to write my books and to do all these things because I was successful as entrepreneur and investor.
That's great. And I love, by the way, for everyone who's listening, I love your previous book, In Defense of Capitalism. I have that one at home. It speaks near and dear to my heart because we speak so much about capitalism on this podcast. And there seems to be so much hatred for capitalism, productivity, entrepreneurship. And this is also one of the first things that you discuss in this new book. Isn't that right?
Yes, my new book, How Nations Escape Poverty. It's about, yes, as the title says, How Nations Escape Poverty. And first, I come back to Adam Smith, who said the most important precondition for escaping poverty is economic growth. And the most important precondition for economic growth is economic freedom. And I think he was wrong in a lot of other things, but in this way, he was absolutely right. And I have another chapter in my book, What Does Not Help Against Poverty. And this is especially development aid. We spend so much, especially your country and my country. We are the champions in the world with giving development aid. And we give it for crazy things like diversity, gender diversity in Bangladesh, or bicycle paths in Peru, and climate things wherever in the world. We give billions and billions. And I have one chapter with a lot of scientific studies that come all to the same result, that in the best way, it helps nothing, but in another, sometimes it's even counterproductive. So it's exactly the opposite. What is the maybe good intention? And then I have these two chapters. I think we will speak about it now, about Poland and Vietnam. Two examples, and maybe I should start why I selected these two countries. There were two reasons. First, I look every year in this index of economic freedom from the Heritage Foundation. And for me, it's not so important the rank in comparison with other countries, but I look what happened over the last 25 years. For example, the United States, they have now the worst ranking since they started the index in 1995. The same is true for the UK, for example. And there are two countries that had a huge increase in economic freedom in this 25 years, and one is Poland and the other is Vietnam. And these are not the most economically weak countries, but I'm not so much interested in comparing it with other countries, but what happened over time, because I think if you want to understand economic development, it's very important to understand the history and whether economic freedom is increasing or decreasing in a country. And this was the reason. There were some very small countries that even improved more in economic freedom, but from the big countries where a lot of people live, it's Poland and Vietnam. By the way, if I ask people, in most cases, if I talk about Vietnam, I start conversation and ask people, what do you think, how many people live in Vietnam? And in almost all cases, I get absolutely wrong answers. Most people don't know it. Do you have an idea how many people live in Vietnam?
I have no idea. I was going to guess something like 30 million.
Yes, this is what most people think. 20, 30 million. No, the reality is 100 million. It's bigger than Germany, every European country. It's 100 million. So it's one of the, according to population, one of the biggest countries in the world. And Poland has 40 million. So these are two big countries. And and they have a lot in common, but maybe we will talk about this later.
Yeah, I was gonna. We can definitely get to that. And I was gonna ask, why not start off with those? You started off with Adam Smith in the book, and some people get turned off by Adam Smith because doesn't he say that extreme selfishness is good and greed is good and all these things? I believe you tackle those arguments in the book, right?
Yes, for some people who don't know much about Adam Smith, he's the Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. Greed is good, but it's very hard to find positive sentences about rich people. Even I would criticize Adam Smith that he's too negative about rich people in his book. But he has a lot of empathy, sympathy, he called it, for poor people. And his book, The Wealth of Nations, is his main concern, his main topics is how nations and people can escape poverty. And this is what a lot of people don't know. Maybe they never read. He has, two popular books. He wrote more books, but they were all burned when he died, unfortunately. And even his heirs thought they will get a lot of money from him, but they had to learn when he died that they got not by far as much as they hoped for, because he gave it away to poor people before. So you see it even in his personal decision that poverty was a very important topic. And I think this is the mistake from some people, even libertarian people who support capitalism, that they don't make this argument strong enough. The most important thing for capitalism is it's important for poor people. The strong people, they come around in every system, even in a dictatorship. But for the poor people, they have no alternative to capitalism. And so we shouldn't, usually people think socialists, they fight for the poor people and the capitalists for the rich. No, I think capitalism is very important for poor people, and I showed with my book. I don't believe so much in theory. I'm an historian and sociologist, and so if I want to know whether capitalism or socialism is better, I don't discuss about theory, what socialists like to discuss about theory, but I look at history, what happened to these countries, for example.
And so you did mention earlier you have a book about, I can't remember the title now, about Hitler and National Socialism. And a lot of people would say that he wasn't actually a socialist, but from a lot that I've read, he was actually very anti-capitalist. And I don't know if this is some sort of game plan for the people who don't like capitalism to try and remove Hitler from socialism. But one thing I was going to ask you, when you go on this liberty road trip and you talk to people about capitalism, what are the kind of arguments that you get back? Because you seem to have a really deep love for capitalism, productivity, entrepreneurship, for development and growth. And these days, those are sort of bad. Those are looked at as bad things because I think they believe there's this fixed pie. And if someone has a lot, that must mean that they took it from someone else. And do you hear a lot of things like that when you go around talking to people?
Unfortunately, I have to admit, most people who come to my lectures are people who believe anyway in capitalism. I hate it because I love much more to discuss with anti-capitalists. Sometimes here in Germany, I have discussion with, for example, we have here a very famous anti-capitalist. She wrote a bestseller with the title "The End of Capitalism," and what she writes, we need a planned economy. And she's very popular here. You can see her every week in every talk show because otherwise our planet will not survive. This is the climate change and environmental argument. And she says we should forbid driving, forbid flying, totally forbid, not building any new houses, and no one should be allowed to eat more than 2,500 calories a day. And she's not a strange outsider here. She's really popular. And so I have to discuss with these people. But in most of my roadshows, I have to admit, there are people, and I think this is a big mistake of the libertarian movement, that they didn't find ways to reach out to people who think different. It's sometimes in a small circle, and I met people from libertarian think tanks in dirty countries, and sometimes I even had the feeling they are happy with this situation. We are the people who have the right knowledge, and sometimes it's even like a cult. I made all my money with a public relation company, so I believe in marketing and public relation, and I think we should think much more how can we promote our ideas to reach out for other people. And I was in Argentina last year and the year before, and I met all these people from Milei's movement, and I saw that they did it different. For example, Milei reaches out especially to poor people. He's supported by poor young men, especially. You mentioned the zero-sum belief. Yes, this is also important for my new book. I think this is the most important fallacy or mistakes from anti-capitalists, what I call zero-sum thinking. They believe that some people become rich because they took it away from the poor. And you can prove it wrong very easily. For example, let's take Vietnam as an example. Vietnam was the poorest country in the world in 1990, poorer than all African countries, even poorer than Somalia or Sierra Leone. It was the poorest country in the world. And the number of people living in extreme poverty was 80%, even in the 90s. Today, it's less than 5%. At the same time, the number of millionaires and billionaires increased. Today, even they have a few billionaires, self-made billionaires in Vietnam. And if it would be true that rich people become rich only because they take it away from the poor, how can it happen that at the same time the number of people living in poverty decreases and the number of billionaires increases? And this happened not only in Vietnam, this happened all over the world. Even in the beginning of the 80s, the number of people living in poverty all around the world was 43%. Today it's 8.5%. At the same time, the number of billionaires increased. In 2000, there were only 500 billionaires. Today we have 2,800. So this zero-sum belief is absolutely nonsense. And I showed in my new book how nations escape poverty, because when you ask anti-capitalist or left-leaning people, how should we fight against poverty, for example, in Africa or in poor countries? Their answer is always, they are poor because we took it away from them and now we should give it back to them, for example, with development aid. This is absolutely nonsense because, no continent got so much development aid as Africa in the last decades. But it's still the continent where there's starvation, hunger, poverty. And if you compare it with Asia, Asian countries got by far not so much development aid as Africa. But they are much better off today. Why? In China, they introduced private property and had their free market reforms with Deng Xiaoping. In South Korea was poorer than, or as poor as African countries in the 60s. And they took the path of the market economy. And of course, Singapore, Taiwan, and all this, a lot of these Asian countries, the way to escape poverty was implementing free market reforms. And I showed in detail with the example of Vietnam what is especially fascinating.
Well, so what? Let's get into that real quick then. What did Vietnam do to escape poverty?
So first of all, they tried what all socialists, after they won the war, they implemented this planned economy system, what was before only in the north of Vietnam, and they implemented then it also in the south, and the situation became worse. Before they had the war with the United States, not only with the United States, before with France and with Japan and with China, they had war with almost everyone. And what was not destroyed by the war was destroyed by the planned economy. And what's very important, what they didn't do, they did not blame the United States or other countries. This is what a lot of African countries do. Oh, this is because of colonialism and we are exploited by the British or whoever. This is what they do, to blame others. The people in Vietnam, they're very smart. They saw that it's their own fault, that it's the planned economy that did not work. Even the Communist Party, they had a party rally, their sixth party congress in 1986, and they analyzed what went wrong. And they saw the only way to escape poverty is to allow private property, to have some free market reforms, privatization especially, open the economy and let foreign investors welcome. You know what anti-capitalists tell us, oh, these foreign countries, investors, capitalists, they're bad and they're responsible for poverty. People in Vietnam, they were very smart. They thought about how can we attract more foreign investors, more foreign money to our country? How can we attract money from Japan or from South Korea or from the United States to be invested in our country? And these economic reforms worked. And if you go to Vietnam, you see, it's amazing what happens there. I have a girl. I had a girlfriend for a lot of years. Her parents were from Vietnam, and she came back now to Vietnam, and she said it's amazing. And of course they call themselves officially a socialist country, and with the leading party, a communist party. But don't get wrong, it's like lip service to Marxism. I was invited to 4 very prestigious universities in Vietnam. For example, a foreign trade university. And I can guarantee you it's much easier to find a Marxist at a university in Europe or in the United States than to find a Marxist at the university in Vietnam. They invited me to a workshop. And the topic of the workshop was, how can we improve the image of rich people? By the way, the image of rich people in Vietnam is much better than in most Western countries. But the question of the workshop is, how can we even further going on improving the image of wealthy people in Vietnam? I was never invited to a similar workshop at a university in the United States or in Europe. So they call themselves communists or socialists, but you see, it's an entrepreneurial spirit, and even the taxes there are lower than I have to pay taxes in New York City because I have two apartments, and if I add all the states and federal taxes and all this, I think it's almost 50% in New York City. And in Vietnam, the maximum tax rate is 35%. So if socialism is 35% taxes and capitalism is 50%, I would prefer socialism in this way.
Is it a similar story with Poland as well?
In a way, similar. In another way, different. First of all, what is similar? Poland had also a war. This in the Second World War, more people died in Poland than in any other country, not in absolute numbers, but adjusted to the population of the country. So they lost most people there in Poland. And after the Second World War, the Soviet Union implemented also planned economy in Poland. So this is the same what happened in Vietnam. And in the 80s, even in the 80s, Poland was one of the poorest countries in Europe. They were much poorer than the Ukraine, for example. And the GDP per capita was even only half of the Czech Republic. And an average Pole earned $50 a month. This was in the 80s. And they had to stand in long queues. By the way, you can see it in my film. Maybe you can add the link. I produced a film about Poland. This is Poland from Socialism to Prosperity. You can find it on YouTube. And there you can see how they had this ration card system. And to buy something, you had to have a ration card, and you have to wait hours and sometimes even days to get maybe shoes or some food, hours or even days. So you have, sometimes they hired other people to wait for them in the line, or their grandma or grandpa or children to have to wait there. And even if you waited there for a couple of hours, it was not a guarantee that you could get something, even not with your ration card. Maybe you waited there 6 or 7 hours, even only to learn that it's sold out, and then you buy anything, even some shoes that doesn't fit to you, because you hope you can exchange it with someone else, maybe your electrician, to bribe him to do something there in your house. And so this was the reality of Poland, one of the poorest countries in Europe. And then in the 90s, so this is similar to Poland, they started with free market reforms. The difference is, in Vietnam, they still have this one-party system. It's not a democracy. They have no freedom of press there in Vietnam. In Poland, they started with democracy. What made the reforms even more complicated? Because if you have no freedom of speech and freedom of press, like in Vietnam, they could implement their free market reforms. There was no fear of any opposition. But in Poland, of course, in the moment when they started their free market reforms, there was a strong opposition. And in the media, oh, you see, it's a crazy idea with this capitalism. It can't work. We should go back to more government, more state. And this was very difficult. And I met you can see him in the movie, the vice prime minister and finance minister in Poland. His name is Balcerowicz. And what is very interesting, he believes in the teachings of Hayek and Mises. And so you see, it's not only a theory, but it can work out in reality. I think it's one of the few examples in the world where economists who believes in Mises and Hayek implemented economic reforms, and they worked out well. And Javier Milei today in Argentina, he's a colleague of Balcerowicz in this way, because they believe both in the same teachings, like from Mises and Hayek. Their personality is absolutely different. Milei, is always shouting, very aggressive, and this Balcerowicz is more like a professors, usually more, not shouting and anyway, but they believe in the same theories, and it worked in Poland. So my book, this book, How Nations Escape Poverty, will be published in Argentina, and I'm proud that the spokesman of Javier Milei wrote the preface for my book, and I wrote a preface for Argentina, and I told people in Argentina, here you see in this example, it can work, but you have to be patient, because what happens all the time, and you can see it especially in Poland, before things turn to become better, things become worse. They had a recession for 2 years, hidden unemployment became open unemployment, and this was a hard time. And this was the message that I wrote in my preface for the edition in Argentina that will be published in August. It's not already published, but I wrote this preface with only one message: be patient. If you think things that were messed up in the last decades, even in 100 years in Argentina, if you think Milei can solve these problems in 6 months, you will be disappointed. Of course, this is not possible. Some things improved now, even in the short time. The inflation rate decreased. But of course, other things will become first worse before they become better. And so I hope that people in Argentina will learn from my book to be patient with Milei.
This is one of the things that we've actually talked quite a bit about, because we've been excited about Javier Milei in Argentina. This is a libertarian podcast, and seeing a libertarian president, obviously we're very excited, but we have been saying, if the people don't, if they're not truly economic libertarians, free market economy lovers at heart, then when things get tougher for them, as they probably will, as they start to lose some of their government handouts, some of their government subsidies, they might end up deciding that Javier Milei is actually part of the problem and deciding to turn against them. And that's been one of the main things we've been talking about, is that we hope that this is a real philosophical transition that happened in Argentina, and that they understand that things might get worse before they get better. I was gonna ask you, do you think that it takes a country getting to 200% inflation for the people to finally wake up and say, oh, actually free markets are much better? So people might ask, why isn't America going through this libertarian revolution, or why isn't Germany going through this libertarian revolution? Do you think that we just become lazy or complacent with how good we have it, and it actually has to get really bad for the people to wake up?
If you look at history, you see that most of the economic reforms happened after things became really absolutely bad. I will give you some examples. You can find them, by the way, some of these examples in my book, The Power of Capitalism. It's a new edition now, an updated edition of The Power of Capitalism. Maybe we can talk in one of the next podcasts. And I have the example there from the UK, for example, before Maggie Thatcher started with their economic reforms. And the UK was the sick man of Europe. They had a high inflation rate, strikes all over the day, everywhere in the country. Even they had to be supported from the International Monetary Fund, that usually supports third world countries. And this, they called it the sick man of Europe. And already then, people in the UK started to try it with Maggie Thatcher, and in the United States it was not so bad, but before Ronald Reagan came, of course it was a very bad situation with high inflation rate and a lot of people jobless. And in Germany we had some free market reforms in the beginning of the 2000s from Gerhard Schröder, who was a social democrat, but he liberalized the labor market and reduced taxes a lot. And this was also after Germany became the sick man of Europe. And there are a lot of examples in history. But to make the thing even more complicated, it's not enough. It's not a guarantee that automatically, if things turn to be bad, then that they will turn to become better. It's, history is not like a Hollywood movie with a guarantee of happy ending. Think about what happened. I give you two counter examples. First, my own country, Germany. We had this very difficult situation in the end of the 20s with 6 million people had no jobs and all these things. And there was not any liberal or libertarian revolution, but the people voted for Adolf Hitler there, and this was what they did. Or another example, I have it also in my book, How Nations Escape Poverty, in the last chapter. It's Venezuela. Venezuela was, in the 70s, one of the richest countries in the world, one of the 20 richest countries. And then they started with a lot of regulation, especially labor market regulation. It was the most regulated country in Latin America. And of course, it caused a lot of problems in the economy. But what happened? The situation became bad. But people in Venezuela, they don't vote for pro-capitalist. But sometimes they think if they are on the wrong way, and then they think we have to go this way even faster, as they did. They voted for Hugo Chavez, and of course things didn't become better. Today what's there in Venezuela, it's a disaster. A lot of people don't know it, but 7.5 million people fled from Venezuela. This is 25% of the population, and the people who stayed there is there's starvation and poverty, and by the way, they abolished, as they do always, the socialist democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of press. So what I want to say, yes, first, it's a precondition. It seems to be a precondition for free market reforms that things become really worse, but it's not a guarantee. There has to be something else, and I understood it when I was in Argentina. I was there several times. They had a very strong libertarian movement there with libertarian think tanks. They invited me to have my lectures there in several cities in Argentina. And I saw, even 1.5 years before Milei was elected, that it was successful what they did to change the mind of especially of young people. And I think this was very important. The most important thing first is things as you do it, I do it. You with your podcast, I with my books. This is important. In the end, of course, you need something, a politician as Milei who can attract people. But first, it all started with changing the mind. It's as it is in your life as a person. If you want to change your life, what's the first thing you have to do? Change your mindset, change the way you think. And this is the same for a country. This is what happened in the UK. I know there's people from the Adam Smith Institute and Institute for Economic Affairs. They prepared everything what Maggie Thatcher did. And in the United States, it was people like Milton Friedman, and it's Free to Choose, and Cato Institute, and all this think tanks, and both things have to come together. A bad economic situation on the one hand, and then all this people have to be prepared from our books, from our podcast, and then they can be successful. This is and you have to explain it in a simple way. This is what the mistakes of a lot of libertarians. They speak too theoretical, and here I have this pricing theory, and I have a Mises quote and a Hayek quote, and this way, it's not the way how to convince people, especially young people. When I was 2 years ago in Argentina, I tried it in a simple way. I remember one lecture, it was not in Buenos Aires, in a small city, and it was maybe 100 young people, the beginning of their 20s, and I did it in this way. For example, there was one guy sitting in the first row, and he was not really handsome, so I thought maybe he has no girlfriend, and I asked him, "Hey, do you have a girlfriend?" And he said, "No, I don't have one." And said, "But would you love to have a really beautiful girlfriend?" And he said, "Oh yes." He smiled. "Of course I would." Then I asked him, "What do you expect? Who will bring you this pretty girlfriend? The government? The state?" And he's laughed. No, I don't believe it. And then I asked him, "But what do you think? Who's responsible to getting that you get this beautiful girlfriend?" And he said, "I think that's me." And I said, "Oh, so this is all this libertarian philosophy. This is not only with the girlfriend; it's with everything." And I try to explain things in the simple way that people can understand. They don't have to understand any theory, and this is the way I'm writing my books. I hope some people will read my books, How Nations Escape Poverty. You can read interviews with people from Vietnam and Poland, and even some funny things, some jokes that people can laugh. For example, they had this joke in Socialism about the queues. I mentioned the long queues where people had to stand in long lines, and they hoped for communism that everything will become like paradise. This is what the communists promised them. After socialism, we will have full communism and everything will be perfect. And so they had the joke in Poland, and they asked, what will be with the queues if we have full communism? And the answer was, there will be nothing to wait for, to stand for in the line. So even some funny things.
That's great. That's great. I recommend everyone go and pick up How Nations Escape Poverty, also In Defense of Capitalism. And you have 27 other books that I didn't just name right then. I'm also going to be putting the links to your 2 films in the show notes for this show. So if you're interested, if you're listening right now, the links are going to be in the show notes for this episode right now. And Dr. Zitelmann, thank you so much for your time today. I know we spoke beforehand. I'm going to catch up with you at Freedom Fest, and hopefully we can do an interview in person at Freedom Fest.
Of course. I look very much forward to meet you at Freedom Fest again. And I will send you now 2 or 3 other links to my books, because for every book I have a website where you can have some samples and some reviews, so that you can learn more about the book, and I will send you some of them.
Great.
Okay.
And everyone who's interested, check those links in the show notes. They're all going to be there when you listen to this episode. Dr. Zitelmann, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you. I thank you.
All right.
See you again at Freedom Fest.
Okay.
Goodbye.